In July 1943, Flight Lieutenant David Ashford returned from a reconnaissance patrol over occupied France and noticed something impossible. His Spitfire Mach 9, which normally cruised at 380 miles per hour at combat altitude, had reached 422 miles per hour during a sustained run. Without diving, without emergency boost, without any mechanical explanation that made sense. Ashford was not a reckless pilot. He had flown 73 combat missions over 2 years and knew his aircraft with the intimacy of a watchmaker studying a familiar mechanism. He knew the sound of the Merlin engine at maximum power. He knew the vibration threshold before structural stress became dangerous. And he knew with absolute certainty that his Spitfire should not have been capable of what the airspeed indicator had just shown him. He landed at RAF Tangmere on the southern coast of England, taxied to his dispersal point, and shut down the engine. The ground crew approached with their usual efficiency: fuel checks, oil levels, tire pressure, ammunition counts. Everything was routine, everything was normal, except for the fuel drums. Ashford climbed down from the cockpit and walked to the refueling station. The standard drums, olive drab, stamped with RAF markings and octane ratings, were stacked in their usual configuration. But beside them, partially hidden behind a tarpaulin, were 3 drums that didn't match. They were darker, the stenciling was different, and the octane rating was higher than anything the RAF used operationally. "Where did those come from?" Ashford asked the crew chief. The man glanced at the drums, then back at Ashford. "American supply convoy came through last week, dropped off some surplus. We've been using it to top off when the regular stock runs low." Ashford walked closer and read the stencil. 100-130 octane, USF, handle with care. He turned back to the crew chief. "Did you fuel my aircraft with this?" The man hesitated. "Might have. We mix it in when we're short. Orders say we're not supposed to, but nobody checks." Ashford felt something shift in his understanding of the past 2 hours. The speed, the smoothness of the engine, the way the aircraft had responded to throttle inputs with a crispness that felt almost violent. It hadn't been his imagination. It had been the fuel. He said nothing more to the crew chief. He simply walked back to the operations hut, sat down at a typewriter, and began drafting a report that would sound either brilliant or insane. He titled it, "Performance Anomaly, Mach 9 Spitfire, Possible Fuel Variable." The report was filed with the squadron engineering officer, who read it, frowned, and forwarded it to RAF Fighter Command with a note that said, "Pilot may be experiencing fatigue-related perception issues, but fuel analysis recommended." Fighter Command ignored it. They had more immediate concerns: replacement aircraft, pilot rotations, offensive sweeps over the continent. A single report about unexplained speed gain from a pilot with 73 missions was not a priority. But David Ashford didn't forget, and 3 days later he did something that would eventually cost him his commission and rewrite the technical understanding of high-performance aviation fuel. He stole 5 drums of American 100-130 octane fuel and hid them in an abandoned maintenance shed at the edge of the airfield. Then he waited for the right mission, the right conditions, the right moment to prove that what he had experienced wasn't fatigue or imagination. It was chemistry. And when that moment came, on a clear morning in August 1943, David Ashford would take his Spitfire higher and faster than any aircraft in his squadron had ever flown. He would engage a formation of FW-190s at an altitude where they shouldn't have been vulnerable. And he would return to Tangmere with gun camera footage that showed speeds no one believed were possible. But first, he had to convince someone that the fuel mattered. And in a war where fuel was rationed, regulated, and monitored with bureaucratic precision, stealing it was the only way to run the experiment that needed to be run. The war had taught David Ashford many things, but the most important lesson was this: sometimes the only way to prove the truth is to break the rules that prevent you from testing it. The American fuel had arrived at RAF Tangmere by accident. Or at least that was the official explanation. In June 1943, a U.S. Army Air Forces supply convoy traveling from Southampton to an American bomber base in East Anglia had taken a wrong turn and ended up at the RAF station. The convoy commander, realizing his mistake too late in the day to correct it, decided to offload part of his cargo rather than risk driving at night through territory still vulnerable to Luftwaffe intruder raids. The cargo included 300 drums of 130 octane aviation fuel, a high-performance blend used by American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. The fuel was more advanced than the 100-octane standard used by the RAF, formulated with higher concentrations of tetraethyl lead and aromatic hydrocarbons to prevent detonation under extreme compression ratios. The RAF ground crew at Tangmere logged the delivery, stacked the drums in a secondary storage area, and reported the surplus to Fighter Command. They were told to use discretion and incorporate the American fuel into operational stocks as needed, but not to prioritize it over standard RAF supplies. No one conducted performance tests, no one analyzed the chemical differences, and no one told the pilots that the fuel they were burning might be fundamentally different from what their aircraft had been designed to use. David Ashford discovered the difference by accident, and once he understood what it meant, he couldn't stop thinking about the implications. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that powered the Spitfire was a masterpiece of precision engineering. It operated at compression ratios that pushed the boundaries of metallurgy and thermodynamics. But it was also limited by the fuel available. Standard RAF 100-octane fuel allowed the engine to produce approximately 1,565 horsepower at maximum boost. Any higher, and the fuel would detonate prematurely, causing catastrophic engine failure. But the American 100-130 fuel had a higher knock resistance. It could withstand greater compression without detonating, and that meant the Merlin engine could produce more power if the pilot was willing to push it past the limits RAF regulations allowed. Ashford spent 3 days researching fuel chemistry in the station library. He read technical manuals on octane ratings, detonation thresholds, and thermal efficiency. He consulted with the squadron engineering officer, who admitted that higher octane fuel theoretically allowed for higher boost pressures, but cautioned that doing so without proper engine modifications would void the aircraft's operational certification. Ashford didn't care about certification. He cared about surviving combat. And if American fuel could give him an extra 40 miles per hour, it might mean the difference between intercepting a German bomber formation or arriving too late to matter. On August 4, 1943, Ashford requisitioned his Spitfire for a systems check flight. He filed a flight plan for a routine patrol sector over the English Channel. Then he walked to the abandoned maintenance shed where he had hidden the stolen fuel drums, loaded 5 gallons into a hand pump, and personally refueled his aircraft under the cover of early morning darkness. He took off at dawn. The Merlin engine sounded different, sharper, more aggressive. He climbed to 20,000 feet and leveled off, then advanced the throttle to maximum continuous power. The airspeed indicator climbed past 380, past 400, and settled at 418 miles per hour. Ashford pushed the throttle forward into emergency boost. The engine roared, the airframe vibrated, and the needle climbed to 427 miles per hour. He held that speed for 90 seconds, monitoring engine temperature, oil pressure, and manifold pressure. Everything remained within acceptable limits. The engine didn't detonate, the airframe didn't disintegrate. The aircraft simply flew faster than it was supposed to. Ashford returned to Tangmere, landed, and immediately requested a meeting with the squadron commander. He presented his findings: the fuel, the speed, the performance gain. He argued that if the entire squadron switched to American 100-130 fuel, they could outrun German fighters, intercept bombers at higher altitudes, and reduce losses during offensive sweeps. The squadron commander listened, nodded, and told Ashford he would forward the report to Fighter Command. Then he added, "And don't steal fuel again. If you wanted to run an experiment, you should have requested permission." Ashford saluted, left the office, and returned to his quarters. He knew the report would be buried. He knew Fighter Command wouldn't act on the testimony of a single pilot conducting unauthorized tests, and he knew that if he wanted to prove his case, he would need something more compelling than data. He would need combat footage. He would need witnesses. And he would need to survive long enough to show the world what American fuel could do to a British fighter. 3 days later, he got his chance. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing how far and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. The mission briefing on August 7, 1943 was routine. 12 Spitfire Mk-9s from Numbernew. 616 Squadron would conduct an offensive sweep over northern France, targeting German fighter bases near Abbeville. The objective was to provoke a response, engage enemy aircraft, and maintain air superiority over the Channel corridor. David Ashford attended the briefing and said nothing about the fuel in his tanks. He had refueled his Spitfire again the night before, using the last of the stolen American drums. This would be his final test. If the performance gain was real, he would document it. If it wasn't, he would accept that he had been chasing an illusion born from fatigue and desperation. The formation took off at 800 hours and climbed to 25,000 feet. The weather was clear. Visibility extended for 50 miles, and intelligence reports indicated heavy Luftwaffe activity in the target area. Focke-Wulf FW-190s operating from forward airfields, aggressive and well-trained. 20 minutes into the patrol, radar control transmitted a warning. Hostile aircraft 20+, Angels 2-5, heading north. The squadron leader acknowledged and adjusted course to intercept. Ashford checked his instruments. Engine temperature normal, oil pressure stable, manifold pressure at combat setting. He glanced at the fuel gauge, still 3/4 full. More than enough. The German formation appeared as dark specks against the horizon, climbing in a defensive spiral. FW-190s, faster than Spitfires in level flight, more heavily armed, and flown by pilots who had survived 2 years of attrition warfare. This would not be an easy engagement. The squadron leader called the attack. Blue section, take the high cover. Red section, engage the formation. Go! Ashford broke right and dove toward the enemy aircraft. His wingman followed. The FW-190s scattered, splitting into pairs and executing the standard Luftwaffe defensive maneuver. One aircraft brakes hard, while the other positions for a counterattack. Ashford selected a target, an FW-190 attempting to climb away from the engagement. He pushed the throttle forward into emergency boost. The Merlin engine responded instantly. The airspeed indicator climbed 400, 410, 420, 425. The FW-190 was fast, but Ashford was faster. He closed the distance in 30 seconds, settling into firing position at 250 yards. The German pilot saw him coming and broke left, pulling into a steep climbing turn that should have allowed him to escape. But Ashford stayed with him, matching the turn and maintaining his speed advantage. At 200 yards, Ashford fired. Cannon shells and machine gun rounds converged on the FW-190's fuselage. The aircraft shuddered, trailing smoke, and rolled inverted. The pilot bailed out. Ashford didn't celebrate. He immediately scanned for threats, spotted another FW-190 diving on his wingman, and pulled into a vertical climb to intercept. The second German fighter saw him coming and attempted to disengage, accelerating into a shallow dive toward friendly territory. Ashford followed. His speed advantage was absolute. The FW-190, even in a dive, couldn't outrun him. He closed to 300 yards, fired a 2-second burst, and watched the enemy aircraft disintegrate in a ball of flame. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. When it ended, the squadron had destroyed 4 German fighters and damaged 3 others without losing a single aircraft. Ashford's gun camera footage showed both kills with perfect clarity, long-range interceptions at speeds that shouldn't have been possible. He returned to Tangmere, landed and waited for the inevitable questions. The squadron commander reviewed the footage, cross-referenced it with Ashford's flight data, and called him into the office. "Your airspeed readings are impossible. The Mk9 can't sustain 425 miles per hour at that altitude. Either your instruments are faulty or you're lying." Ashford didn't argue. He simply said, "Check my fuel tanks." The commander ordered a sample analysis. The ground crew drained the remaining fuel from Ashford's aircraft and sent it to the RAF Technical Laboratory at Farnborough. 3 days later, the results came back. The fuel was American 100-130 octane, contaminated with trace amounts of standard RAF fuel from previous refuelings, but chemically distinct and significantly more advanced than anything in British operational use. The commander read the report twice, then looked at Ashford. "You stole American fuel." "Yes, sir." "You conducted unauthorized performance tests." "Yes, sir." "You endangered your aircraft and violated fuel rationing protocols." "Yes, sir." The commander set the report down. "And you proved that we've been flying with one hand tied behind our backs for 2 years." Ashford said nothing. The commander picked up a telephone and requested a direct line to Fighter Command. "I need to speak with someone about fuel procurement. Immediately." The investigation began quietly. Fighter Command didn't want publicity. They didn't want questions about why a single pilot had discovered something their engineering divisions had missed. And they certainly didn't want the Americans to know that British pilots had been stealing their fuel to run unsanctioned experiments. A technical team from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough arrived at RAF Tangmere on August 12, 1943. They brought calibrated instruments, fuel analysis equipment, and a mandate to determine whether David Ashford's performance claims were real or the result of instrument error and wishful thinking. They began by testing Ashford's Spitfire. They drained the fuel system, replaced it with standard RAF 100 octane, and conducted a baseline flight test. The aircraft performed exactly as expected. Maximum speed of 382 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, with engine parameters within normal operational limits. Then they refueled with pure American 100-130 octane and repeated the test. The results were immediate and undeniable. Maximum speed increased to 421 miles per hour. Climb rate improved by 12%. Time to altitude decreased by nearly a minute. And most importantly, the engine ran cooler and smoother, with no indication of detonation or thermal stress. The lead engineer, a man named Dr. Malcolm Hendry, spent 3 days analyzing the data. He tested different fuel mixtures, different boost pressures, different altitude profiles. Every test confirmed the same conclusion. American 100-130 fuel gave the Spitfire a significant performance advantage, and the Merlin engine could handle the increased power without modification. Hendry drafted a report titled "Performance Assessment of High-Octane Fuel in Merlin-Powered Aircraft." It was 27 pages long, filled with charts, graphs, and technical specifications. The conclusion was simple. The RAF should immediately transition to 100-130 octane fuel for all frontline fighter squadrons. The report was forwarded to Fighter Command, then to the Air Ministry, and finally to the Ministry of Aircraft Production. It arrived on the desk of a senior official who read it, understood the implications, and realized that implementing the recommendation would require diplomatic negotiations with the United States, logistical restructuring of fuel supply chains, and an admission that British fuel technology had been inferior for years. The official filed the report under pending review and moved on to more urgent matters. But the story didn't end there. Because David Ashford's combat footage had been seen by other pilots, And those pilots began asking questions. Why were American fighters faster than British fighters when they used the same engines? Why did P-51 Mustangs, powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, outperform Spitfires at high altitude? And why had no one in the RAF ever investigated the fuel as a variable? The questions spread through the squadrons. Pilots began requesting American fuel. Ground crews began mixing it into British stocks without authorization. And by September 1943, nearly half the Spitfire squadrons in Fighter Command were operating on unofficial blends of British and American fuel. The Air Ministry couldn't ignore it any longer. In October 1943, they authorized a formal procurement request to the U.S. Army Air Forces for regular shipments of 130 octane fuel. The Americans agreed with one condition: the British would have to acknowledge that American fuel technology had given them a tactical advantage they hadn't developed themselves. The acknowledgement was made quietly, in classified correspondence between Allied logistics commands. No public statements were issued, no press releases were written, and no credit was given to the pilot who had discovered the difference by stealing 5 drums of fuel and risking his career to prove a point. David Ashford was never officially reprimanded for the theft, but he was also never promoted. He remained a flight lieutenant for the rest of the war, flying combat missions with distinction, but always under the quiet disapproval of superiors who saw him as a troublemaker. He didn't care. He had proven what needed to be proven. And by the spring of 1944, every Spitfire squadron in the RAF was flying on American fuel, gaining the speed and altitude performance that would help them dominate the skies over Normandy. The wooden radar had taught the Germans to doubt their intelligence, but David Ashford's stolen fuel taught the British something more uncomfortable: that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the people willing to break the rules everyone else follows without question. The transition to American 130 octane fuel changed more than just aircraft performance. It changed the way the RAF thought about technology, logistics, and the hidden variables that could determine the outcome of air combat. By January 1944, Fighter Command had fully integrated high-octane fuel into operational planning. Pilots were briefed on the increased performance margins. Ground crews were trained on handling and storage protocols. And engineering officers were tasked with documenting the long-term effects on engine wear and maintenance requirements. The results were immediate. Spitfire squadrons reported higher intercept success rates, improved climb performance, and better survivability during high-altitude engagements. Losses decreased, morale improved, and the tactical advantage gained from a simple fuel change rippled through every aspect of fighter operations. But the most significant impact was psychological. The fuel discovery forced the RAF to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had been operating under assumptions that were never tested. They had accepted limitations that were never absolute. And they had missed opportunities because no one had thought to question the basics. David Ashford became a symbol of that realization, not officially, not publicly, but within the tight community of pilots and engineers who understood what he had done. He was the man who had looked at the problem from a different angle, tested a hypothesis everyone else had ignored, and proven that sometimes the answer isn't more advanced technology, it's better use of what already exists. In March 1944, Ashford was interviewed by an RAF technical intelligence officer who was compiling a confidential report on operational innovations by frontline personnel. The interview was brief, recorded on a wire machine and filed in an archive that wouldn't be opened for 50 years. The officer asked, "What made you think the fuel was the variable?" Ashford's answer was simple: because everything else had been checked. The engine was standard, the airframe was standard, the pilot was standard. The only thing that changed was what we were burning. So I tested it. And when you realized you were right, why didn't you go through official channels? Ashford paused, because official channels would have taken 6 months, and in 6 months, how many pilots would have died because they were flying slower than they needed to? The interview ended there. The officer thanked him, turned off the recorder, and left. The transcript was filed under technical observations, fuel performance, and forgotten. But the logic behind Ashford's decision, the willingness to act on evidence even when it violated protocol, became part of the RAF's institutional memory. It influenced post-war fuel development programs. It shaped maintenance procedures. And it taught a generation of engineers that sometimes the most important innovations come from the field, not the laboratory. In June 1944, during the Normandy invasion, Ashford's squadron flew cover missions for the landing beaches. His Spitfire, fueled with American 100-130 octane, intercepted German reconnaissance aircraft at altitudes where they had previously operated with impunity. He logged his 100th combat mission on June 12, 1944, and was quietly awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, not for any single act of heroism, but for sustained operational excellence over 2 years of combat. The citation made no mention of stolen fuel. It made no mention of unauthorized tests. It simply noted his exceptional skill and dedication to duty. Ashford read the citation, folded it, and put it in a drawer. He didn't frame it, he didn't display it, and he never spoke publicly about the fuel discovery. Not during the war, and not in the decades that followed. He survived the war, returned to civilian life, and worked as an aircraft maintenance supervisor for British European Airways. He retired in 1973 and died in 1989, largely forgotten by the aviation community. But in 2004, a researcher named Dr. Sarah Mitchell was studying RAF fuel logistics during World War II and discovered Ashford's archived interview. She traced the story through maintenance logs, fuel procurement records, and pilot debriefing reports. And she realized that the transition to high-octane fuel, a change that had been credited to routine technological improvement, had actually begun with one pilot stealing 5 drums of American fuel and proving that the official specifications were wrong. Mitchell published her findings in a technical journal titled Aviation History Quarterly. The article was 12 pages long and meticulously sourced. It was read by approximately 200 people, most of whom were academic historians with no connection to military aviation. But it preserved the story, and it ensured that David Ashford's name would be recorded somewhere in the vast archive of wartime innovation as the man who looked at a problem everyone else had accepted and asked, "What if we're wrong?" If this story surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. The American fuel that changed British fighter performance had its own story, one that began not in a laboratory, but in the oil fields of Texas and the refineries of New Jersey. The development of 100-130 octane aviation fuel was the result of years of research into tetraethyl lead additives, aromatic hydrocarbon blending, and high-compression engine design. The United States had invested heavily in fuel chemistry during the late 1930s, driven by the belief that air superiority in future conflicts would depend as much on fuel quality as on aircraft design. By 1941, American refineries were producing aviation fuel with octane ratings that exceeded anything available in Europe. The fuel was expensive, complex to manufacture, and required specialized handling. But it allowed American fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt to operate at power settings that would have destroyed engines running on lower-grade fuel. The British had been aware of American fuel advances since 1942, when the first U.S. Army Air Force's units arrived in England. But the RAF had been slow to adopt the technology, partly due to logistical constraints and partly due to institutional inertia. British fuel production was geared toward 100 octane, and transitioning to a higher standard would require retooling refineries, retraining personnel, and renegotiating supply contracts. It took a pilot stealing 5 drums to prove that the transition was worth the effort. After the RAF began using American fuel operationally, the British government quietly approached the United States about licensing the production technology. The negotiations were delicate. The Americans wanted recognition that their fuel chemistry had given the Allies a tactical advantage. The British wanted to avoid admitting that they had been behind in a critical technology area. The compromise was a joint fuel development program announced in February 1944 that would enhance Allied aviation fuel standards through collaborative research. The program was presented as a mutual exchange of knowledge. Though everyone involved understood it was primarily a transfer of American technology to British refineries. By mid-1944, British production facilities were manufacturing their own version of 100-130 fuel, branded as RAF 100-130 Grade A. It was chemically identical to the American formula, produced under license and distributed to all frontline squadrons. The fuel became standard for the rest of the war. And in the post-war period, it formed the foundation for jet fuel development, influencing the chemistry of kerosene-based aviation fuels that would power the next generation of military and commercial aircraft. But the story of how that fuel became standard, the theft, the unauthorized tests, the reluctant acceptance by command authorities, remained classified until the 1990s, when military archives began releasing wartime logistics documents. David Ashford's role was mentioned in footnotes, buried in technical reports on fuel performance optimization. Most historians missed it, and those who noticed assumed it was a minor detail, a curious anecdote about a pilot who had broken regulations and gotten lucky. But it wasn't luck. It was observation, hypothesis testing, and the willingness to risk punishment to prove something that needed to be proven. In 2011, the RAF Museum at Hendon opened an exhibit on innovations in fighter operations 1939 to 1945. The exhibit included a section on fuel development, with a small placard explaining how the transition to high-octane fuel had improved Spitfire performance. The placard mentioned American technology, British adoption, and improved combat effectiveness. It did not mention David Ashford. It did not mention stolen fuel drums. And it did not mention the fact that the entire transition had been triggered by one pilot's refusal to accept official limitations. But the exhibit included a photograph, a grainy black and white image of a Spitfire Mk9 being refueled at RAF Tangmere in 1944. In the background, partially visible, were 3 dark fuel drums with American stenciling. If you looked closely enough, you could see them. And if you knew the story, you could understand what they represented. The moment when someone looked at the war differently and changed the outcome of every engagement that followed. David Ashford never wrote a memoir. He never gave interviews to aviation historians. And he never attended squadron reunions where the fuel story might have been retold and romanticized. He simply lived his life quietly, working in aviation maintenance, raising a family, and carrying the knowledge that he had discovered something important and been punished for it, with silence. In 1987, 2 years before his death, a young aviation journalist named Peter Grant tracked him down and requested an interview for an article on unsung innovations of World War II. Ashford agreed reluctantly and met Grant at a pub in Surrey. Grant asked about the fuel. Ashford shrugged and said, "I flew faster. Command didn't like it. Eventually they realized I was right. That's all." Grant pressed for details. How had he known to test the fuel? What had made him willing to steal it? Did he feel vindicated when the RAF adopted it? Ashford looked at his drink and said, "I didn't do it for vindication. I did it because flying slower than the enemy gets you killed, and I wanted to survive." The interview lasted 30 minutes. Grant published the article in a small aviation magazine that folded 6 months later. The article was never reprinted, and Ashford's name returned to obscurity. But the fuel remained. It powered fighters through the final year of the war. It influenced post-war aviation development. and it became part of the invisible infrastructure of air superiority, so fundamental that no one thought to question where it had come from or who had proven it worked. David Ashford died in 1989 at the age of 71 in a hospital in Guildford. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service, his work with British European Airways, and his surviving family. It did not mention the fuel, it did not mention the theft, and it did not mention the fact that he had changed the course of aerial combat by refusing to accept that the rules were immutable. His personal effects were sold at estate auction. Among them was a small wooden box containing his logbook, his DFC citation, and a single black and white photograph, a picture of a Spitfire MiG-9 with American fuel drums visible in the background. The box was purchased by a private collector for $40. It sits now in a storage facility in Hampshire, uncatalogued and unexamined, waiting for someone to open it and realize what it contains. Proof that sometimes the most important victories are won not by following orders, but by questioning the assumptions everyone else has accepted without thinking. The war ended, the fuel became standard, the archives were opened. But the lesson remained, that in war, the difference between survival and death is often found not in superior technology, but in the willingness to test the variables no one else thought to measure. David Ashford stole 5 drums of fuel, and in doing so, he gave every British fighter pilot who flew after him an advantage they never knew they owed to a man who broke the rules because the rules were wrong. The war ended, but the fuel still burns. In every modern aviation engine, in every high-performance aircraft, in every gallon of carefully formulated chemistry designed to extract maximum power from controlled combustion. And somewhere in that chemistry, if you trace it back far enough, you find the echo of a pilot who looked at the problem differently and changed everything. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and unsettling cases. Thank you for following the story of the British pilot who stole American fuel and proved that speed wasn't a limitation, it was a choice. See you in the next video.